Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Emir Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Chaf Gimel Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today, we're actually in middle of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Chaf Beis, and that would be Siman Shin Tesvav Sif Gimel. It's in the very bottom line of the Mishnah Berurah Kuf Chaf Gimel Amid Aleph. I think you could probably tell already that I'm suffering a little bit from laryngitis. Hopefully I'll be able to make it through this year. So I'm going to try to use fewer words than usual. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for all those that find themselves in harm's way. B'chol makom shehem. So we're discussing the halachas of an oihel arai, creating a temporary, flimsy type of horizontal roof covering over an area. Now, we have learned that to construct an oil kva is in Isser Daraisa. To construct an oil arai can be an Isser Darabanan. In order for the construction of an oil arai to be Asim in Darabanan, it has to meet certain requirements. So, the first question is, what is the purpose of this oil arai that is being constructed? If an oil arai is being put up to serve as a shelter, if it's asur lahagein, if it's meant to shelter the area underneath, and the area underneath is going to be used, so if you put up some kind of an oil arai to provide shade, or you put up an oil arai to protect from the rain, so that's asur lahagein. Such an oil arai is also midrabanan, even if there are no mechitzos, even if the area underneath the oil arai is not surrounded by any walls whatsoever. This is still going to be asur. It's an oil arai that is asur lahagein, and therefore it's also midrabanan, even if there are no mechitzos. On the other hand, if you have an oil arai that is not asui lahagein, if you have an oil arai where it's not being put up for the purpose of providing shelter for the area underneath it, in that case, the construction of such an oil arai is only asur if there are mechitzas surrounding the area underneath the oil, and furthermore, the construction of this oil arai is only asur if it is done kisidron, if the construction of the oihel is being done in the typical way that construction is being done. What does that mean? That means that first you put up the walls, and then you put up the roof. Now, to illustrate this concept, in Sif Gimel, the Mechaber discussed the case of somebody who stands up a bed, and the bed has a solid headboard and a solid footboard. By standing up the bed, what you're doing is, you're creating an area that is sheltered. You're creating an area underneath the bed platform that is sheltered by the bed platform, and it has two mechitzas. It has the mechitza formed by the headboard and the mechitza formed by the footboard. Said the Mechaber, in this case, this is not an oil that is asur lahagein. The bed platform is not being put up to shelter the area underneath the bed. The bed platform is being put up so you could use the upper surface of the bed to lay on or to sit on. It's true that you do have an area underneath the bed where you might stick your slippers or you might stick your shoes. But certainly, the point of standing up the bed is not to shelter the area underneath the bed. So this is an oil arai that is not asur lahagein. Therefore, in order for it to be asur b'drabanan, it has to have mechitzas. Now, this does have mechitzas. It has the headboard and the footboard. Okay, but now the other requirement for it to be asur b'drabanan is that it has to be built kisidron. So the Mechaber said as follows: were you to stand up the headboard, stand up the footboard, and then put on the horizontal bed platform that forms the roof, that would be asur b'drabanan. Oil arai, it's not asur lahagein, but it has mechitzas, and you did it kisidron. You put up the mechitzas and then you put up the roof. that would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. However, if you take away any of the two requirements, so for example, let's say you don't do it Kisidron. Let's say you have two friends help you. They hold the horizontal bed platform in place, so the oil is put up first. Then you stand up the headboard and the footboard. In that case, it wasn't done Kisidron. So, since it's not done Kisidron, it's not Asur Midrabanan. Or, said the Mechaber, you could take away the other requirement, and that is take away the mechitzas. So let's say you have a bed that does not have a solid headboard and a solid footboard. It just has four legs at the corners. So now you don't have mechitzas. So now, even if you put up the legs and then you put up the bed, it's an oil arai. It's not asui lahagain. It's not being put there in order to shelter the area underneath, and it has no mechitzas. Since it has no mechitzas, this would be mutter even midrabanan. This is all what we learned so far in Sif Gimel. Now, in Mishnah Berurah Katan Chaf Beis, we did the beginning of Mishnah Berurah Katan Chaf Beis. The Mishnah Berurah brought down a Taz. Now, the Taz discusses the question of when we say that an oil arai that is not asur lahagen, like the bed, is asur midrabanan if there are mechitzos surrounding the area underneath the oil. And it's a mutter if there are no mechitzos underneath the oil. How many mechitzos are we speaking about? In the case of the Mechaber, when we're talking about the bed, we only have two mechitzos, right? Because the Mechaber talks about, well, actually, I take that back. The Mechaber is really not clear when he says how many mechitzos there are. I keep on saying the headboard and the footboard. The Mechaber doesn't say straight out that he's talking about just a headboard and a footboard. So the Taz has this question. Is the Issa D'Rabbanan only if you have four mechitzos surrounding the area underside the bed? Or is it enough to have even, let's say, two mechitzos, only the headboard and the footboard? So the Taz brings down the Lashon of the Torah. The Torah makes mention of four mechitzos. The Lashon of the Torah is arba dapin mechubarin, four boards. So that would be the area is completely surrounded. However, the Taz says that the Torah is lav davka. In order for this to be asur b'drabanan, by the case of the bed, you don't need four mechitzos. Even if there are only two mechitzos, it will still be asur b'drabanan. Now, when it comes to this shaila, the Taz draws a distinction between the case of a bed and the case of a table. And what the Taz says is, by a bed, we typically do use the area underneath the bed. People put their shoes and their slippers underneath the bed. So there is some level of utility in the area underneath the bed, and therefore, says the Taz, by a bed, even if there are only two mechitzos surrounding the area underneath the bed, this is asur midrabanan. But by a table, says the Taz, we don't generally use the underside of a table. We don't use that area underneath the table. People don't store things underneath the table. And therefore, says the Taz, in order for the table to be asur midrabanan, you would actually have to have four mechitzos surrounding the entire area underneath the table. That's what we're up to so far. And now we're going to pick up on the very bottom line in the Mishnah Berurah on Kuf Chav Gimel Amid Aleph, right by the Ois Katan Lamed for the Shar HaTzion, in the middle of Mishnah Berurah Katan Chaf Beis. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to bring down a shita that's even more makel than the Taz. There are those achreidim that are very makel in the case of a table. And they say that you're allowed to put up the table board, the tabletop on top of the legs, even if the area underneath the table is surrounded on all four sides. Why? The mistama ain't sarich la'avir shetachtav. Because one of the additional requirements in order for an oil arai to be asa b'drabanan that we learned about earlier on Kuf Chav Beis Amid Beis in Mishnah Berurah is cut in Yud Zayin, were the achrayim that say in order for an oil arai that's not asa lahagein to be an issa b'drabanan, there has to be a tzorich. There has to be some purpose, some usage of the area underneath the oil. And these achrayim say that by a table, mistama ain't tzarich la'avish atachtov, im lo shadak or lehistamisham. We really do not use the area underneath a table. It's not only that it's not typically used, it's mistama ain't tzarich la'avish atachtov. It has no usage, no purpose at all. And therefore, even if the area underneath the table is surrounded on all four sides by mechitzas, and even if you erected it kisidron, you put up the mechitzas and then you put up the tabletop, there are achrayim that say that this is still mutter, unless you happen to use the area underneath your table. However, points out the Mishnah Berurah, Lashon HaShulchan Aruch, the language of the Shulchan Aruch, Shekasav, who writes, V'chein raglei hashulchan. If you look in the words on the Mechaber speaks about the mita, and he says that by a mita, if it only has four legs and it doesn't have mechitzas, it's mutter. And then the Mechaber says, V'chein raglei hashulchan mutter b'chol gavna. The Mechaber seems very much to be equating the halakha of the table and the halakha of the mita. So the Mishnah Berurah points out that doesn't sound like this from the Shulchan Aruch himself. Mashma the b'shulchan that by a shulchan im hayu mechitzas hayu gam kein tzarich la'achmir. The Mechaber says by the bed, if there are no mechitzas, if there are only legs, everything is mutter. But if there are mechitzas, then the shulchan becomes like the bed. You have to be machmir, and you can't put up the top. Valkein, and therefore says the Chavetz Chaim, Nachain bevadei lachush l'divrei hataz. We definitely should be concerned for the shitas hataz. Lechais hadaf ba'avir, that if you want to put up the tabletop on top of mechitzais, you have to hold up the tabletop in the air, v'yachdisu tachtav haraglayim, and then put up the mechitzas so that you're doing it shaloi kisidron. Umashma medivrei Pri Megadim, it is implied by the words of the Pri Megadim, T'chol zeh dafka kisha betaltal haraglayim mimakim lamakim kedei lahanyach alei amadav shalamala. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here for the Pri Megadim is, this whole iser midrabanan of putting up the mechitzas and then putting up the oil on top is only germane if what you're doing is you have the mechitzas already standing. Let's say the mechitzas were already standing before Shabbos. Well, in that case, in order for this to become aser, you would have to move the mechitzas to a new location and then put the board on top. Because only then do we look at it that on Shabbos you put up mechitzas and then an oil, kisidron. If the mechitzas were put up on Thursday afternoon and on Shabbos afternoon you came and you left the mechitzas exactly where they were, and now you put a board on top of them, then you didn't erect mechitzas and then an oil kisidron on Shabbos. But if the mechitzas were standing from Thursday afternoon, and now on Shabbos afternoon you relocated them to a new place, and then you put the board on top, then we do look at it that you erected the mechitzas and then an oil arai on top of them, kisidron on Shabbos. That would be also midrabanan. The oz nechshav kishem amidon l'tzarich zeh kilu hischil ba'asiyas ha'oil, because now it looks like you're putting up an oil on Shabbos. Aval, however, im oimdin b'makom echad, if the mechitzas remain in one place from before Shabbos, afilu lahataz, even according to the Taz, mutar lahaniach alayim hadaf, you would be allowed to put the tabletop on top. Even if you're talking about a table that has mechitzas on all four sides, If they were standing there before Shabbos and you do not relocate them, it would be mutter. Moving along to Mishnah Berurah's Katan Chaf Gimel. So the Mechaber told us that this whole Isser is only when you have at least some mechitzas surrounding the area underneath the oil arai. However, were you to have a bed or a table that only has legs, simple legs at the corners, so there are no mechitzas, then the Mechaber said mutter b'chol gavni. This would always be mutter. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, the raglei hamitos v'shulchanos, because the legs of beds and tables, shalanu, are types of beds and tables, ein lehem mechitzos. They don't form mechitzas. They're simple, narrow legs at the corners. V'nireh the kol zeh k'shahiyah rafui. Now the Chavetz Chaim brings up another issue. We're talking here essentially about erecting beds and erecting tables on Shabbos. Now, we have only been analyzing this shaila here in Shin Tezvav from the perspective of the Isser of Asiyas oil, of creating an oil, creating a shelter. However, we have to remember that there's also the shaila of boineh, of doing construction, and makeh b'patish, finishing a keli, tikkun moneh. So it says the Chavetz Chaim, v'nireh, t'chol zeh k'shahaya rafui, our whole discussion that allows you to put up a table or a bed when there's no shaila of asiyas oil is only if the parts of the bed and the parts of the table go together in a weak fashion, so that it's a little wobbly. The parts aren't going together tightly. However, if you're taking a tabletop and you're putting it on top of legs in a way that the legs fit into sockets, let's say, in the underside of the tabletop, and when they go together, they're going to connect and they're going to be firm, they're inserted strongly, as is the case with many tables, this would be also because of binyan. Because remember the rule, even though generally we say ein binyan b'kelim, not if it's strong. When it's binyan gomor, when you're doing a real bona fide act of baineh, there is binyan even by kelim. So if the parts of the table or the parts of the bed go together firmly, that would be a problem either of baineh or of makeh b'patish. Now, even if you'll say, I'm going to put it together in a weak way, I'm not going to push it in really tight, we learned earlier in Shin Yud Gimel, if the parts are intended to go together tightly, and it's the derech liyos takua, then there's an issa d'Rabbanan. You're not allowed to build this. By bed, also, if the legs of the bed attach to the bed frame firmly, you're not allowed to do this. We covered these halachas from the perspective of baineh and makeh b'patish. We already covered this in Shin Yud Gimel. Moving along to Sif Dalid, in the middle of the top line, Kuf Chav Gimel Amud Beis. Says the Mechaber, Mita shehemusureges pirush ne'ereges, a bed where the bed frame is woven b'chavolim using ropes. So you've got the bed platform. Now the bed platform is what supports the mattress. Now that bed frame could be made many different ways. It could be a solid flat board, or it could be a rectangle of wood, and then you could have ropes going back and forth, interwoven together, and that forms the support for the mattress. That's what we're talking about here. A bed where the upper surface is not solid, it's woven out of ropes. Let's say you only have a few ropes going across this bed frame, and the gap between the ropes exceeds 3 tvachim. So you have 3.5 tvachim between the ropes. Why are we mentioning 3 tvachim? So everybody who's learned halacha for a while recognizes right away 3 tvachim is the magic number of limud. If the gap is less than limud, less than 3 tvachim, then we consider it as if the area is closed. But if it exceeds 3 tvachim, we cannot apply limud. So says the Mechaber, if you have the upper bed surface that's woven with ropes, but the area between the ropes is more than 3 tvachim, and the ropes themselves are certainly narrow, well, in that case, when you put up this bed top, you don't have an oil. There's no oil here, right? Because yes, you have a horizontal platform of some kind, but there's no solidity here, right? You only have narrow ropes, and they're spaced apart more than the shel lavud. So essentially, right now, you do not have an oil. So mitashu misereges pirush dereges b'chavalim im yesh ben chevel lechevel shlosh tvachim aser lifrais aleim sadin mishum da'avid ahaloi. You're not allowed to spread a sheet on top of the bed top. So in other words, it's Shabbos. Shabbos afternoon, somebody wants to take a nap. The bed is here, but the top does not constitute an oil because there's no surface really. There's no solid surface. There isn't even a part of it that's a tefach wide. Now to spread a sheet over it, you're creating a roof. Now you're creating an oil arai. So that's why the Mechaber says, also lifrei salim sadin mishum da'avid ahaloi, and v'chein similarly, also l'salek beged atachton me'alea mishum da'kasasar ahaloi. You wouldn't be allowed to remove the sheet if the sheet is on it, because by removing the sheet, you're destroying the oil. You're removing the oil. So this would be binyan and stira. However, says the Mechaber, however, if you already had part of the bed covered by at least a tefach from before Shabbos, so you had a pillow that was covering part of it, and the pillow is more than a tefach wide, or you had a blanket folded up on part of the bed top covering more than a tefach. Well, now, now you could cover up the whole bed. Why? We know why. Because all you're doing is being moisif on a pre-existing oil arai. You already have an oil of a tefach from before Shabbos. To cover the rest is only being moisif on an oil arai. To be moisif on an oil arai is mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kadachaf Daled. Mita Shehi points out the Mishnah Berurah. I hope everybody realized this. Well, of course, coming off everything that we learned in Sif Gimel, this whole shaila is only germane if we're talking about a bed that has mechitzas underneath. So in other words, in Sif Gimel, the Mechaber told us the whole shaila of oil arai by a bed is only germane if there are mechitzas, because it's an oil arai that's not asul lahagen. It's ilhagen. In Sif Dalid, the Mechaber is telling us a new halacha, but it's coming off of Sif Gimel. If you have a mita that has mechitzas underneath, so you put up the mechitzas, you put up the bed top. Now the bed top is a woven bed top, and it's not solid. There's no area that's a tefach. So okay, so far you didn't make an oil. So far you're in the clear. But now if you take a sheet and you spread it up on top, now you made an oil. But if part of it was already a tefach, so then, and you put it up before Shabbos, now to put an oil on it is not a problem because you're only being meisif on an oil arai. The point of this Mishnah Berurah, is realize this whole shaila is only germane if there are mechitzas underneath. If there are no mechitzas underneath, then this is an oil arai that's not also lahagen, and you can do whatever you want. If the gap is less than 3 tvachim, arminan lavud, we would say that the area between the roofs is closed. Ukesasa meikara damya, v'chanabasif beis. V'ayin shama Mishnah Berurah, dafilu rak b'makabechad ayapachas b'shosh tvachim gam kein sagi. We don't need that there should be a gap of less than 3 tvachim between every set of ropes. Even if between 2 of the ropes there's a gap of less than 3 tvachim, that area is closed. Already you have a tefach area closed. Now anything you do is only being meisif on an oil aray. Oiskan chafav. V'im haya, if part of it was already covered, a tefach, kam bazeh atam mishum demut al haisef al oil aray b'Shabbos. Okay, now we're going to turn to Sif Hay. Now, Sif Hay is a fascinating Sif, and Sif Hay is going to bring up a lot of contemporary shilas, which we're largely going to go into those in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow, but Sif Hay is going to lay the groundwork for a lot of contemporary shilas. Says the Mechaber, Kisei ha'asri prakim, a folding chair. Now, the folding chair that we're talking about over here, what's coming to my mind is these folding, I think they call them beach chairs. So it's a folding frame, and the seat, the back and the seat, are made out of a soft fabric. And that's really what the Mechaber is talking about here. He's talking about a folding, collapsible frame that has a seat and a back that's made out of leather. So when you fold it, the seat collapses, folds in on itself. When you open it, the leather sheet is extended. So really, when you fold this chair, you're folding up a leather sheet. When you unfold the chair and open it, you're opening up a leather sheet. Now, when you open up that leather sheet, you're also forming an oihel aray. You're forming a horizontal covering over the area that's under the leather sheet, right? When it was folded, no, the area wasn't covered. Now you open up the folding chair, you've got a leather sheet covering up an area underneath. Now, apparently, they had chairs like this that when you open them, they also had mechitzas underneath. So it wasn't a folding chair that had 4 legs and you could, see right away underneath. No, this was somehow, when you opened it, the area underneath the seat of the chair was surrounded by mechitzas. So here we have a bona fide oil aray shaila, right? You're creating an oil aray. Now, it's not osil hagen. The point of the chair is not to shelter the area underneath. So it's certainly not osil hagen. But it's an oil aray that's not osil hagen, and it has mechitzas underneath. So l'chayra, you have room here to declare whether the Yisud D'Rabbanan kicks in or not. That's what we're discussing here. And we're going to find that we're going to have a very interesting heter that's going to tell us that this is mutter. Kisei also prakim, this folding chair, ukisharoitzim leishev alav, when you want to sit on it, paischin aisai, you unfold the chair, you open it up, v'ha'oyer niftach, and the leather sheet spreads out. Ukishim esira maisai, when you want to take the chair away, saigrim maisai, you fold it. V'ha'or nichpal, and the leather folds up. Says the Mechaber, mutter lepaschai lechatchila. You're allowed to open it up lechatchila. No explanation given, but the Mechaber says you're allowed to open this lechatchila. Now the truth is, if you look at the Yud from the Be'er HaGolah, you'll see that this comes from a Gemara in Shabbos. It's a Brisa brought down in the Gemara in Shabbos, Kufla Lamed Ches Amud Beis. The Brisa talks about a kisei traskel, a folding chair. And this is exactly how the Rishonim described this folding chair. When you open it, the leather spreads out. When you close it, the leather folds up. And the Brisa says it's mutter. Okay, so it's a Brisa in Shabbos. The Brisa also doesn't say why. The Rishonim go into why. And that's where we're coming from. But the Mechaber paskins like this Brisa. It says that this is mutter even lechatchila. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kan Chav Zayin, mutter lepaschai. Why? Why is it mutter? Now, before we see the why, we have to take a look at Sharet Tzion on his cut Lamed Beis that tells us something very important that I already told you. But I want you to see it inside in the Sharet Tzion. So he brings this down from Rashi, and he says, V'hainu, this heter of the Mechaber, afilu haya hakisei asoi im mechitzos. Realize that the Mechaber is addressing a case where when you do open the chair, the area underneath is going to be surrounded by mechitzos. Vayidei pshita nivshatin gam ha-mechitzos. Dim loikein, because if not, belavach yishari l'fi masha pasuk hashachanach leil b'sif gimel. If there are going to be no mechitzos under the folding chair, like our folding chairs, when you open up the folding chair, there's no mechitzos underneath. So then it's an oil arai that's not osir lahagain, and there are no mechitzos. So sif gimel, do the math. 100% it's mutter. I don't need any new heterim. The need for a new heter over here is because there are mechitzos that open up underneath when you unfold the chair. And therefore you have a bona fide shaila of an oil arai that's not osir lahagain, and it's surrounded by mechitzos. That's why we need a new heter here. Now let's go back to the Mishnah Berurah's Kol Chav Zayin. What is the heter? So the Chavetz Chaim brings down the lashon of Rashi, and the Mishnah Berurah doesn't give us a lot of hezber of Rashi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you know why this is mutter? De ha'avid v'koi mi ba'od yoim. Because this oil arai was already built before Shabbos. Ovid, it is already made. V'koi, it's already established. Mi ba'od yoim. Ella shepoishtoi umiyashvoi kedei leishav alav. All you're doing is opening something which is pre-constructed in order to sit on it. It sounds the easiest way to understand this heter is that the whole Isser of Asiyas oil is built, no pun intended, it's built on the Isser of Boineh. Now, it could only be Asser if you're building something. Over here, you're not building anything. You're not, when you build the bed, so if you build mechitzas, you put up a headboard and you put up a footboard, and then you build the roof, you take a roof and you put it on top of the mechitzas, so you went and you built an oyel arai, and you did it kisidron. You put up mechitzas and then you put up a top. So even though it's not asel hagain, it's awesome. But when you unfold a folding chair, you didn't build anything. You didn't build mechitzas and put a roof on top. This whole construct was pre-constructed. All you did was unfold something. And that, says Rashi, and brings down the Mishnah Berurah, is why this is mutter. Because you haven't done anything. And says the Mishnah Berurah, based on this same rationale, we have a much bigger heter. Shari lahamin achupa, you're allowed to put up a canopy or lasalka and to take it down. What does this mean? Take a look at Sharet Tzion Ois Cotton Lamed Daled. Hainu, this means kishahoisa achupa kishura ba'klonsais me'erev Shabbos. If you have a fabric sheet, aka a chuppah, a canopy, tied at the four corners to four poles, and it's all tied together from before Shabbos, and you want to take it on Shabbos afternoon and stand it up and spread it out, you're allowed to. Now this is a much bigger heter. You know why? Because now you're talking about an oil that's also lahagain. An oil that's also lahagain is even more chamor than an oil that's not also lahagain. And still, says the Mishnah Berurah, based on this Sif Hey, since this is pre-constructed before Shabbos, if you wanted to take the four poles, put up the four poles, and then put the sheet on top, that would be usher. But since the fabric top is already tied to the poles from before Shabbos, says the Chavetz Chaim, this would be mutter. V'hu adin, continues the Mishnah Berurah, hadaf shekavua b'kaisel shebebeis hakneses, a board that's attached to the wall in the shul, shemanichim alav sfarim, that you put sfarim on top of. What's this talking about? This is talking about the shtenders that have a hinge. They're hanging on the wall, and they're hanging flat against the wall. When you want to use it, you open it up, and it has a swinging support that goes underneath it to hold it up. And when you finish, you take your sitter, you put it away, and you collapse the shtender. Now realize, when you open up that shtender, what are you doing? You're making a covering, right? You're sheltering over the area underneath. Says the Mishnah Berurah, based on this heter, this is also a shaila that doesn't start Why? Because it's pre-constructed. It's attached to the wall from before Shabbos. Now, it points out the Mishnah Berurah, you don't have to come on to that heter. Miu, bedaf, balavach yishari. This would be mutter anyway. Because when you open up that stender, this is not asay lahagein. You're not doing it to make an oil. There are no mechitzas underneath. So that child doesn't even start. Why exactly the Mishnah Berurah mentioned this heter in the context of this case, I'm not sure. The Mechaber said this is mutter lechatchila, to unfold the chair. Umito shal barzel, metal beds shalanu. Sha'asuyin mekupalanu smuchen lakaisel. They had a bed that was hinged and attached to the wall. And when you wanted to use it, you swung it up and you folded down legs. Okay, we're going to continue on this same theme as we go further. Thank you so much for bearing with my voice. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. This is limud HaTorah should be making. I got Klal Yisrael. The Rabbi Shalom should send Yeshua's for first panos and shadduchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the BS called Tzedek Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.